Hello and welcome to Android Developers Backstage. My name is Nick Butcher and I'm from the Developer Relations team.
I'm Tora Norby from Android Studio.
I'm Diego Perez and I'm an engineer on Android Studio.
I'm Chris Cinco, UX design lead on Android Studio.
And I'm Nicolas Rode, leads on Studio.
An episode after my heart with lots of Android Studio in it. Sounds great. So I guess we're going to talk about Android Studio.
We are. This is a special Compose focus episode. So we're going to be asking a lot of questions about Android Studio's Compose support. So maybe we could just start there. Could one of you perhaps give us an outline of the features that we've added to Android Studio to support working with Jetpack Compose?
Traditionally, we had a number of tools for previewing layouts. So obviously, Compose being a UI toolkit, what we've been working on is also tools to preview those composables. The main thing that we have is the preview, and it is basically the panel that sits next to your code. So you can see anything that you have in your code and you annotate with, we have an annotation that is called add preview. You can see it rendered there. The preview renders what you are going to see, but it also allows you to see, for example, the boundaries of the different composables. So that is one of the tools. Another tool is the layout inspector, which is not a new tool, but we have basically worked on it to include Compose support. So you can do the same thing. You can connect your device, run a Compose application, and then inspect what it's in it. Those are some of the tools.
And I'm pretty sure we have a lot more. Do you want to sort of round out the rest?
We have been doing a lot of work, for example, around editing and even within the preview. The preview is just the entry point for a number of tools. So we have also what we call the interactive preview, which is currently in experimental. But what it allows you is to be able to run the composable. So you can actually execute it, not only a static preview, but you can actually click and you can see the animations and how it reacts. So you can see the contents and the state changes. And another tool that we've been working very hard at is animation preview. Compose has a very large number of new APIs for animations that are really great. And one thing that we want to help with is basically being able to see those previews, like what animations you have and how they behave. We have started working this animation preview that you can see the different animations that you have in a composable, how many you have, and you can basically repeat them and see how they work.
Sounds like a lot of great tools.
I think in general, the direction we took was to be very code-centric, to essentially say, okay, Compose is going to be everything in code. Let's support that as best as we can. That goes with more features in the code editor as well, specifically for what we call the design tools. We have pickers and panels to help you write this code still visually, but fundamentally you're thinking in terms of the code that you generate versus what we were doing before with the view system where it was more okay, let's maybe hide that XML. Here it's more no, the code is there.
So to be clear, when you say code-centric, you mean we're not thinking about drag and drop WYSIWYG tools like we had with the layout preview panel, but we're focusing on writing the Kotlin code that Compose kind of embraces.
Not thinking about could be kind of putting it strongly.
That doesn't mean that we will never do WYSIWYG, but it's more in terms of prioritization. We try to focus first on a set of tools that you get the most advantage of the existing tooling we had. So mostly we thought about its visualization, its possibly navigation, inspection, and in terms of the code editor, that could be code completion, navigation to doc, some of those pickers I talked about. So this is more this kind of first phase. In the future, I hope at some point we'll have a WYSIWYG tool, but, we had to prioritize.
From the UX perspective, Compose is really, the whole idea is you create these small reusable functions that are meant to be, whether they're a screen or a widget or a component. And I think with the preview, we really tried to lean into that. So it's every preview in some sense is these small components. So you can test all these components in isolation. You can build on them. You can iterate on them. Then you can remix them into screens. And I think that model we didn't quite have with XML. In XML, I think we treated it as everything is a layout. And that maybe was a little too generic.
I remember we had the tools attributes and sample data. And I remember I think both Nicholas and Diego demoing this, in previous conferences, right? Tools, we have new attributes. It was a lot of effort to put together and it was always an afterthought. So I remember pulling up in larger advanced applications. Most layouts were very uninteresting because they would just have some basic containers and then all the interesting stuff happened in code. If you were really dedicated to the layout editor, you would go and you would decorate this with sample data. Most people didn't do that. But it seems like with Compose, this is kind of a convention that's being pushed pretty heavily. that were injecting data right from the beginning. Can you talk a bit more behind that and some of the additional things we built for preview that wasn't possible before?
As you said, before in the layout editor, we had the tools attributes, but in Compose being code, you can do anything. So we have focused around like providing the tools that you can use in code to inject that data. One example is in any composable that you have that is a preview, you can inject like a parameter. And that parameter can come from a list. So you can have a list of names or a list of data classes that you want to use. And with that, you can populate and you can see the same composable render like multiple times.
That's new. So in the past, there was like always one rendering.
Yes. So as Chris said before, the previous tooling, it was very focused on layouts, and we are now more focused on components. So you can still render screens, but if you have a component, you can imagine how you wanted to see it render with multiple strings of different sizes, or maybe with different data populated. That is one of the APIs that we added that allows you to do that kind of thing. Yeah.
In our work in some of the sample applications, I found that super useful. Rather than with the previous layout editor, it kind of drove you to think about one particular configuration, which obviously we're Android developers, we have to support multiple configurations at once. And I've found adding multiple preview annotations really helps with that. So I will commonly, when I'm starting working on a screen, create the preview first and add a bunch of common previews I slap onto it so I can visualize the screen in, landscape, portrait, a large screen device, light mode, dark mode, and have like 5 or 6 previews ready to go. And it helps me to like think about, okay, how is this going to scale? Does it need to scroll? And all these different dimensions that we have to think about when we're developing for Android.
Yes, that is something that is slightly different in Compose. So before, if you wanted to see your layout or your activity in different themes, what you will need to do is to switch the theme in the layout editor. So one by one, and you can compare. So now what you will usually do is, as you said, you will define 2 previews, which is just simply adding, for example, the preview annotation twice. And you say, I want to render in night mode and in day mode. And then you see them side by side, which is actually very useful because that is how you work, right? Like you edit the code and you want to see how it behaves in all the different conditions. You can customize many things, like, again, the size of it, the day and night at the device. So you can see side by side multiple devices or different theming.
Did you say you could add or repeat the annotation?
Yes. So you can add the preview annotation as many times as you want. And what that does is renders the same component multiple times side by side.
And so then there are attributes on the preview annotation where you're sort of configuring what it's doing.
Yes, that is what you will do. So you have day, night mode and size, but you have like font scaling and other parameters. You can also assign them a name, or you can even group them. Like we have a group name and you can basically group them in different tabs. So you can actually have multiple previews that are related in one group. Like, I want to see all my previews that are related to this theme, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a good practice. And it sounds like it's a recommended and established practice that when you build a composable, you build a preview. Is there a convention emerging for, how many previews you put in and how you divide up your compilation units? Do you put all your composables in one big file or do you sort of spread them out?
I guess that we have different sample applications. I guess that we can talk about that. But for example, in GenNews, usually what you will have is the component, and next to the component, you will define the preview. And then maybe define multiple previews for that component, depending on how you want to set it up. So you can imagine setting up a preview for like an empty state of a list, saying it's like, there are no elements, setting another preview next to it that is populated with 3 items. So that is one example.
In the file, you put the composable, and then you throw the previews for that composable below it, and then maybe one file per composable. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. We had preview before for XML, and it was great. It was super fast. And I noticed that Compose preview is not super fast. Is that related to this being code?
Yes, that is one of the challenges that we had with Compose. For the layout editor preview, you will have an XML, and usually you will have items like a text view, or like you will have a recycler view. All those come with the libraries. So they come pre-compiled. So for the layout editor, it will only need to look into the XML and basically call into those views and render them. So now it's very different because in Compose, you basically are creating custom views. It's not custom views, but every composable is a new component. And any change that you make requires a compilation. So that means that you have to call into Gradle and say, hey, can you please compile this again? And then we render the preview. So yes, like that is one of the challenges that we have right now, which is that process hasn't been particularly fast. So we are working on how to improve that.
I think though what is interesting about Compose, it is quite slow for the compilation speed, which we are vastly trying to improve. But I think one of the unique things about it, previous from the preview tools before, is that with interactive preview, you can test your component pretty easily. As applications grow, there's many screens, there's many components, there's entire design systems. And so being able to just say, I want to test this part of my app without having to actually deploy the app and navigate to that app and get into a certain state. There's actually some kind of like a benefit also of the compilation because we can reflect state and just that fidelity of what this UI would look like on a device a lot faster or upfront than we used to with XML.
Some things seem to be faster. Like if I'm tweaking a color, it seems to be nearly instant. Why is that?
Yeah, that is one of the features that we are working to try to make it faster. So it's live editing of literals. It's very common that you are editing a component, you're just tweaking it to get it to look in the way that you want. So you might be tweaking patterns and maybe like colors and some other like strings. So for those, right now, what we do is we avoid compilation. So if you change any of those, like the preview will immediately update with the content. If you have a device connected and with the application running and that element is on the screen, it will be the same. You change the color and then the color will immediately update. So that way you can prototype in this type of change much quicker.
So that's literals. So things like primitives, strings, those are nearly instant.
Yes, it has to be primitive types. So if you have a Boolean or ints or strings or some of those types, then you will basically see them updated instantly.
Cool.
And if compilation is the bottleneck here, do common strategies apply? Like, so if you modularize your build, then you have, smaller modules that have to be rebuilt to update the preview. Is that becoming a best practice?
Yeah. Any good practice that basically you apply to your application to make it compile better. So anything that you were doing before that makes your application compile better and you can basically develop faster, it will apply here. So as you said, like creating smaller modules, it will help because then what we have to recompile is a smaller amount of code. So that actually helps a lot into getting like your preview faster. So that is one of the things, yes.
So one module per composable. Got it.
Yeah, exactly.
Wait.
One of the advantage as well with the compose approach is that it does tend to push developers to create components, right? So the actual situation is less bad than if we were to do the same approach with the view system, right? Because you're going to have smaller components. And so compiling only those small components is going to take not as long as what you would possibly expect, right? So all in all, I think we'll end up in a relatively good state. But yes, there's a bit of growing pain too, but it's getting there.
And just to be clear, again, we are always working into how to make this process faster. We are aware that the faster that the preview is and the faster that we can actually compile your application, the more productive that you're going to be. So that is something that we are still looking into and how to make it better.
Yeah, and there's a number of things there, right? There's the Kotlin compiler, which, there's a new front end coming. There's configuration caching, which is really important to turn on. I think we're putting the final wraps on that. I guess depending on which Gradle plugins you're using, it may or may not work, but I think we're pretty close. And I believe that in Arctic Fox, we're shipping with some diagnostic tooling in the build speed tab, which will encourage you to turn it on if you're eligible. And I think both of those should help a lot. And then I guess we have some other things that we're working on too.
Pivoting away from performance a little bit, just coming back to the previews, like one limitation I've always found is that you have to have 0 parameter preview function, right? Because you need to be told what data to render the composable. Like composables declare their dependencies as, function parameters. And so to have a preview of that, you need to supply all those. Does it also work with default arguments with Kotlin? And didn't you talk about iterating over a list? Is that with the preview parameter provider? Is that right? Could you maybe elaborate on how you populate your previews?
Yes, if you have like composables with no parameters, then yes, you just annotate it with preview, it will work out of the box. Default parameters will also work. So if all your parameters are defaults, then you can also apply the preview and that will work out of the box. But then yes, we have the preview parameter provider. And what that does is you can specify the first parameter as like non-default and you can have a string, let's say, or a data class. It doesn't have to be a primitive, so it can be anything. And then what you have is a class that actually injects data into that. So let's assume that you want to have 3 previews with different content. Imagine like a news article and you want to try with 3 different versions of the article with times and different content. What you will put it is into a list and then it gets injected into the preview and you will get them side by side, the 3 of them render at the same time.
Nice. That's super handy.
The other thing about preview, which maybe it's like a mental model shift, is I think previously you would work on one layout and you'd think about it as like, this is my one screen. With preview, usually you want to start with one preview within the compose file you have. But the neat part about, because it is code, you can say, oh, I'm working on this, let's say card, but I'm going to use this card in context of like a list on a different screen or maybe multiple screens. Within the same file, you can also create multiple previews that show that same component being used in that context. So as you're working through it, you can see these things side by side, which I think can be powerful in the workflow.
Yeah, that was kind of eye-opening for me. I was playing with one of the samples, the calculator app, and it was really a good demonstration of composing. First, I saw there's a composable for a button, a calculator button. And then there was another composable that just assembled those buttons into sort of a button panel. And there was a separate composable for the LCD panel. And then there was a composable that sort of took those composables and nested them together with the display and calculator buttons below it. And so at each level, for example, for the button layout, you could sort of see what happened with the horizontal layout and the vertical layout. And for the LCD screen, there were some other options, right? Font size and things like that. And so really sort of composing the app together, the preview works at each level, right? Not just for the overall screen, which I think we struggled with in the past.
The other thing I found super handy, I think Chris mentioned this earlier, but I kind of want to build on it, that you don't have to navigate somewhere in your app. I mean, if you were used to kind of making tweaks like deploying to your device, how annoying is it when you have to I have to navigate 4 screens deep and then get it into this state just to see my changes that I've been working on. The fact that it cuts out all that navigation step, I found to be a huge time saver, to be honest.
Talking about navigation, any preview that you have, you can actually deploy to device. So if you have like a button that you are playing with and you want to see how the ripple behaves or you are tweaking something on it, there is an icon next to it that you can click and you can run just that button isolated. You can run a full screen or you can run that component that you are working on to the device so you can play with it. Which sometimes, again, clicking in the preview is nice, but sometimes you need the feel of like sliding or like clicking or something that is like very specific to the device. So you can also do that without navigating to it.
And that works because we're encouraging composables to not have spaghetti references to the rest of the app. The model is, hey, this composable is an isolated unit. It should just sort of have data for itself. It should not be poking into activities and things like that, right?
Yes, that is a good practice that we suggest in general for previews. So anything that can render in the preview panel will be able to deploy to device. And yes, it's better to avoid dependencies like to activities, or we don't allow network access, for example, or if you want to do I/O access in a database. I mean, not that those are things that you will do directly from the composable, but don't refer them from the previews that you have. It's better to customize the data, inject it, and you can have some sample data to play with.
I've actually found that writing a preview of a component is a great way to enforce that you are following best practices, that there aren't any hidden dependencies or assumptions, or that your dependencies can be swapped out, or you could use a fake instead. So actually, I found that if you are using an app preview annotation while you're developing a component, when you come to test that component, it's generally pretty straightforward because you've already verified that you're providing all the properties that the component needs to load. So it helps with your testing as well, I found.
Yeah, I think those good practices were always there, but I think people developed applications with the view system before we had the full-blown layout editor, infrastructure. So then it was more like a retrofit, like, if you didn't plan for it, maybe it worked, but maybe you were doing not quite the right things, and then you were like, okay, let's not bother. Well, here with Compose, that's also why we try to focus on bringing tooling so that it's there at day one. We get people used to this tooling and being able to develop their composable, their applications with that tooling in mind. And as you mentioned, Nick, it's actually really useful as a developer because it actually helps you do the right thing.
So if I run my composable on a device, I guess one reason I would do that is to see animations, like you said, ripples. Do we have any other tooling to support animations in Compose?
Yeah, we have the animation preview. So from the regular preview, if you have animations, you can navigate to it. So you will go through to the interactive preview, and from there you can navigate to the animation preview.
Say more about the interactive preview. What is interactive about it?
Basically, you can run the component. So in this case, if you want to see the ripples, you don't need to deploy to device. You could actually just do it from the preview. You could click interactive preview, which is the button next to the preview, and that will run the code. So if you have a ripple, you can click it with the mouse and see the animation and see how it behaves.
I see. So normally clicking on it would select, but now the component is instead behaving as if it's...
Yeah, by default, if you click the button, it will navigate to where in your code you are using that button. If you are in the interactive preview mode, the click will behave as on device. So it will run, you will see the ripple or any animations or any transitions that you have.
To stress that, it runs the code, right? So say you've got some internal state in your composable, say it's like, a card which you can expand or collapse and you're toggling some Boolean mutable state of within your app. Like you can actually execute that right there in the preview with the interactive mode, right?
That was the most eye-opening thing for me. I mentioned a calculator demo. I showed that in the Google I/O demo from last year, 2020. it actually works. That calculator app, it correctly works in interactive preview, the calculations of adding numbers. Because again, it's not depending on running activities and things from the system. It's basically, hey, I have some model code stashed. I have a number and I have some operators. You had attached those callbacks, right? Okay, take this number and take that number and multiply them, or whatever the function was that you'd attached. That we can run. I think that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, if you follow the good practices that we said before, like again, the calculator usually doesn't require network access, or it doesn't like save anything to the database. So the calculator is a perfect example of like something great to preview, because you can run it directly from a studio. You don't need to put it on the device, and you can click it and it will run the code, see the animation, see the theme, and see everything from there. That's good.
One thing that's really nice with the interactive preview is also the possibilities that it opens for the tooling, right? Because now we essentially can run the entire stuff, but within the context of Studio, we have some ideas on how to expand the type of things you can do with it. Essentially more introspection, more way to look at what's happening right now when you interact with it, right? So I think that's a tool that, we are really actively working on, and that's going to evolve into something very powerful for developers.
Even now with the interactive preview and the live editing of literals, again, this process of like tweaking certain values, and when you are prototyping a component, it becomes like a very natural experience, and the feedback loop is really good and very fast. You can edit the literals, you basically make it work and in the way that you want. And then you can use the device if you want to test something more complicated, but you get to the person much faster.
It's probably worth mentioning that live editing literals is not just for the preview. That also works when you run your app, which is kind of magical, right?
Yes, it's great. You change any literal and you see it in your application running.
It's not just for previews?
It works in your application. So if you have your application running and you edit any of the primitives that we said before, then you can see it live, like it automatically updates the application.
And that's because this feature is integrated with apply changes. It's pretty cool.
The animation preview is really powerful because you can slow down the animations, see how values are changing over time, and see how things are choreographed. But because of live literals, you may see something, you're like, actually, I want to tweak that duration or that part of the tween, and then you can kind of replay it pretty quickly.
Actually, like the animation and animation preview is actually a great example of the difference between running your application on device and playing with it, or even editing live, like with the live literals. You can do all of that on device as well. But where the tooling in Studio becomes really powerful is when you want to go to a deeper level of understanding. And the animation preview is starting to show some of that. You can go play the animation and then actually even just go through the animation back and forth. You can just drag that play situation wherever you want, pick whatever state you want. So essentially that's, at first glance, you could say, okay, well, if I can run my animation on device, why do I need those tools in Studio? Yes, you can do that. But with the tools in Studio, you'll have a lot more interesting information and ways to interact with it.
Being able to grab the timeline scrubber and go back and forward and just really dial in every bit of an animation is amazing. I love it. But I had a question about the animation inspector. So we have a number of levels of animation APIs. We had a previous episode about this. I kind of think of them as like the animator state at the top, and then you have transitions, which are kind of like animator sets, and then you have lower level thingies like animatable. Where does the animation inspector sit? What does it let you inspect? Is it all of those levels, or is it a subset?
For now, what we have that you can play with in the canaries, it's only doing the transition ones, but we're actively working on adding more, right? And the same thing for the transition. We want to show better visualization of what's happening, of how specific values evolves over time, things like that. But it's important to think about it in the context of the interactive preview, right? Because some of the animation that we do in Compose, it's going to be like, well, for example, a ripple, right? Or simply like how an element that you click on reacts, right? And even though, they may not show in the timeline just yet, you can still play with them in Studio within the context of interactive preview.
Speaking of the animation inspector, it seems very similar to the kind of motion editor. What's up with motion layout in Compose?
It's the same team, so it's normal that they kind of look similar in terms of the tooling. Trying to reuse some of the design elements and components. Specifically for motion layout and constraint layout, they're actually available as well in Compose. It just presents to you a different way of thinking about animation, right? So both models can work depending on your needs. We actually just released the first beta of constraint layout Compose yesterday. So that's very fresh. It's considered as feature complete. We got constraint layout with it that you can set up constraints using Kotlin DSL, either using constraints as a modifier, following the common compose pattern, or moving those constraints into the constraint set, which is super handy specifically for animations. And we have motion layout. It has slightly less power than the view version for now, because we don't handle in the motion layout itself touch gestures or multi-state. The only thing that we do for now is we handle two states, a start state and an end state, and a progress. But you can easily combine, and it's all developed on GitHub, so you can actually go and check the examples. You can easily combine the existing compose primitives to actually build, touch handling and multi-state and etc. And there's a few examples of that in the repository.
Is that how you intend for it to be done, or are you still working on adding out more features to motion layout under Compose?
For 1.0, we are kind of feature complete. There's a couple of stuff that we are still working on overall. One is visualizing the constraint in Studio. So it's there, right? If you get the library, you open the Compose preview, you will see the constraint when you hover the mouse on it. But we're still working on it. I think we could do a better job. That's kind of like a first step. The other thing that we've done that's interesting, at least as an exploration, is you can specify those constraints, as I mentioned, either as modifiers or as a separate object, a constraint set. That constraint set can be expressed using the same DSL as for the modifiers. It's very similar in Kotlin. But you can also specify the constraint set as a JSON object. That comes pretty handy, specifically around the live edits that we talked about with the live literals, because that means that anything that you edit in that JSON string can be reflected live. And so that goes beyond the simple editing of literals of values, because here you can actually completely change the content of that constraint set. And that applies for motion layout as well. And in motion layout, we have two modes. One mode where essentially you pass two constraint set and the progress, and another mode where you pass an entire motion scene that contains the entire scene description. And we've been playing with an interesting prototype that, again, you can grab from the GitHub, but that essentially exposed this JSON to provide live edits and more interesting stuff. A lot of that is very prototypey right now, and we are playing around with what we can and cannot do. So it's still up in the air on how everything is going to gel in Studio, but I'm pretty excited about the direction.
Speaking of releases, I guess maybe we buried the lead, but Compose has reached 1.0. Yay! This is the first of the podcasts released after it went 1.0, right, Nick?
Yes, I think. It should be.
Yay, so pop the champagne. It's done. Now we can sort of move on to something else, right?
Wait, this is a podcast for the studio people, so I guess you're more interested in the fact that Arctic Fox has gone stable.
No, it was a joke. We have grand plans to continue supporting Compose tooling, and I guess the library as well, but, for this group, tooling. We haven't talked much about the layout inspector. Why did we have to do anything to make the layout inspector work with Compose? Why doesn't it just work out of the box?
It's simple. The layout inspector inspects your view hierarchy. Turns out you don't have a view hierarchy in Compose. So, at first it just did not work. You just had essentially a black box. So we adapted the layout inspector to essentially introspect what was happening on screen within Compose to give you like a similar hierarchy of what was going to happen. So visually, it looks actually relatively similar to the layout inspector that you used. Internally, it's totally different. And in fact, what you can expose is also different. So one thing that is kind of really cool is Compose, you have this notion of semantics nodes and semantics information, and we can support that and provide that to you in the layout inspector.
What's an example of a semantics node?
Accessibility, for example, right? And I think that's actually an area that is really promising in terms of more things that we could do in that space.
Just to make sure I understand, by accessibility, something like if I'm looking at an image, if there's an description tag, that's would show up in the layout inspector.
Yeah. And on a side note, I've always been keen on trying to support accessibility. And one of the things I really enjoyed with Compose is when you use an image, it kind of strongly implies that you should set up a content descriptions. And that's really, really good.
More than that, it's a required parameter, so you can't use the image function without it, right? You can pass null, it's a nullable parameter, but you have to explicitly say that this is, decorative only and doesn't require. I love it too. I think it's great.
Semantics are really powerful because, sometimes the system is smart enough to be like, oh, this is a button or this is an image. But other times you have like a specific component that's custom. The talkback may not know what it is specifically. So with semantics, you can kind of tell the system, hey, this is actually a card or whatever component you want to call it for the user. What's great is the layout inspector shows that information so you can see that at runtime.
And do you get all the fancy bells and whistles of the layout inspector? Like, does it update as you scroll, or do you get the 3D view as well?
There's some aspect of that we're still working on, but most of the features are there, yes.
The other thing I thought was really cool about the layout inspector with the classic view system was the ability to figure out, hey, why is this label red, for example? Sort of the whole resource querying, a bit like the Chrome DevTools. Do we have anything like that for Compose?
We essentially show you like all the call stack so you can see the different attribute passed, and that gets you there.
I think with the classic view system, part of the reason why this feature was so important was that it's really hard to understand why,
yes,
where something came from. Are you saying that in Compose? Well, it's the call stack. So nearest container is the one that wins. There's no such thing as like crazy theme overrides and...
Yeah, it's not quite like that. And actually, that's one of the big advantages of Compose, right? It's kind of cleaning up this approach, these APIs, and really bringing you to a more functional approach of thinking. And that actually helps a lot. I think it helps while you develop those components. In the preview, it helps when you look at the state of your running application as well, right? Because essentially the input is clear, and that makes it much simpler to reason about.
It's just code, right? You walk the call stack, right? And you can see where something replaces something else rather than having to hold all these inheritance rules in your head of like, there's a text appearance beat view attribute or whatever.
Yeah, I just saw a tear roll down Diego's face because, the first project he worked on in Studio many, many years ago now was a theme editor trying to make sense of the complications around themes.
Yes, theming around views, they are difficult. Again, it's a very powerful system, but it's really hard to get it right. And yes, we spend a lot of time trying to make that experience easier. And now with Compose, it's so much better.
It was really powerful, but it was missing some really key things. And that's why I think CSS is very powerful, but it's also that hard to build tooling around. But the Android view system, because you don't have style classes, just makes everything really, really crazy.
I think it was one of the situations where it was too powerful, and so sometimes it's actually important to be opinionated. And we've seen that, with Android X, Jetpack, and with Compose, it can help to set a stronger direction.
And just the language you work with now, right? We have types, right? As opposed to everything being XML and then just a bag of attributes. We actually have like types save lives.
It's strongly typed, not stringly typed, which is, really, really important. What did we forget to ask about around Compose tooling?
Or any favorite features that we've added for Compose that you love, you want people to know about?
I talked about it, but the interactive preview is really my favorite. The benefit of tweaking things and seeing them react immediately, it's really great. And to me, that was a big change from the layout editor and having to run it on device.
So my favorite's the font scale. We didn't actually have that feature before in preview, and there's so many sliding scales of font scale on the device. And so being able to actually see your layouts in all the different font sizes is really useful.
I appreciate that because I actually run, with my age now, I actually run my Android device with larger fonts enabled. And I continue to see things that are not working quite as well. And it's obvious that developers haven't run with non-default fonts. And so I think bringing some more awareness to that is really great. So agreed.
I would have to add, though, that if you are still using the view system, we've been also developing interesting tooling around that, right? We have the layout validation that does provide this type of visualization. And of course, this is also going to be brought up to our Compose tooling, right? But you're not on your own either on the view system. We've got your back too.
I was going to add a small tip. I just go the other day, some of the live templates you've added for Compose. So if you type COMP, enter, it creates the function signature for a composable method, which is like super handy because like you create a bunch of these little small ones all the time, right? So that's handy.
I think in general, that's a very good tip. There's a lot of hidden features in Android Studio. And so I think to regularly audit all the intention actions and to regularly audit all the live code templates is really useful because once you learn how to use live code templates especially, but also like post-fix completion and all these things, it really does increase your productivity.
There's a preview one too. I think it's PREV.
You can wrap some of the composals in columns or boxes or rows as well, I think, with WC, WR and so forth, which is I found handy as well. Yeah, I love finding little tips like that. It makes me feel like a ninja.
Well, I guess we've reached the end of this discussion. It's really exciting to see and use. Definitely, I'd like everyone to try Compose. I think it's a huge step forward.
stable now. There's no reason not to. It's the future.
Sound like an ad.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.